In our reflections on the meaning of life as seen through philosophy, our last sojourn was with Heidegger's political philosophy. And as you'll remember, Heidegger not only developed a philosophy of authenticity that concerned the individual, he didn't just talk about the need for us to understand that our human lives end in death, that we live in historical circumstances, and we must hope to make the best of unique opportunities that we might discover through realizing that our life may be short. What we saw in our last conversation together was that, in fact, Heidegger was a member of the Nazi Party. The philosopher we'll first consider now is Jean-Paul Sartre. And Sartre, in fact, was involved with the French resistance to the Nazi occupation. How could two people, you would at least think, be more different than Heidegger, the Nazi Party member, whether or not that impacted his philosophy, and Sartre, the French resistance fighter who fought Nazism? Turns out to be the case that Sartre was enthralled with the philosophy of Heidegger, and in fact studied Heidegger's philosophy, not with Heidegger, but in Berlin in the 1930s. Heidegger, as we know, wrote a book entitled Being and Time. The time part of the book had to do with the notion that any meaning we would find in life had to be in our time and had to be caught up in our historical circumstances. And we have much to worry about regarding Heidegger's own historical circumstances and how he, in this way that is so at best awkward and perhaps painful to have to realize, got caught up with a terrible political movement. Sartre writes a book called Being and Nothingness. Oh my, here we come with nothingness again. Now, many thought, and Sartre himself thought, that he'd captured what Heidegger was writing about when Heidegger wrote Being and Time. Sartre thought that he caught the meaning of being in time in Sartre's own book, Being and Nothingness. And one of the essential messages of that book is that we make our own meaning. If there's going to be any meaning, we have to make it for ourselves. Otherwise, we are nothing. Now, this upsets Heidegger, who writes a letter on humanism. And in this letter, he says that our first priority is to be open to meaning, maybe endure and need to experience that there is no significant meaning available to us. Heidegger says you can't manufacture meaning, therefore Sartre is wrong. And this launches us into the ideas of Sartre. Sartre offers philosophical guidance in living through distinguishing who we are from what we are. And he focuses on the what question. What are we? Not who are we, but what are we? The who assumes, well, that sort of question often requires a more fundamental framework regarding what it is to be human. Who considerations typically assume a framework about the what. And the task then is to find one's place within this framework of the what, such as perhaps is offered by an organized religion, or maybe in our time, in many people's cases, by a large company. Now, the axial model that we've looked at from the beginning of our lecture series together, and on the other hand, a far more secular model, we'll call it the enjoyment and productivity model, these the notion we're in but not of the world, and the other that we're very much in the world, have been dominating ways of establishing frameworks. I have probably exaggerated a bit, but the one model says we're not of any other world than this one, and the earlier axial model says we are in some way, however metaphorical, not altogether of this world. In important ways, we belong elsewhere. Now, in terms of these models, one is either a soul or, at an extreme, a biological organism capable of planning a complex set of instrumental activities. What Sartre does is offer us a very radical way of asking the what question, the question of what framework we could belong in. For us, then, is a who to live our lives. He wants to concentrate first on the what question. And he thinks that separates from metaphysical assumptions, that we shouldn't make an advance and assume about the nature of the universe. What we should be asking simply is, what are we? What are we? And that this question should also be separated from various psychological theories that claim either to tell us our nature or to offer us psychological guidance with respect to our psyches. Now, Sartre provides a somewhat unique and actually quite controversial account of the nature of our consciousness. He writes a great deal about the notion of consciousness. And what he tells us is that consciousness is a dynamic field that is continually in play. Sounds almost as if he never slept, but I think what he meant is while he's awake and when any of us are awake, our consciousness is continually in play. A word he uses to describe our consciousness is to say that it is intentional. That is, it's always directed towards something. That's its object. Pause for a moment as a thought experiment with your consciousness and try it out. Be conscious. Aren't you always conscious of something? Isn't there always an object there? Try for a moment to be conscious just of your consciousness. If you're like me, you draw a blank. And that's Sartre's point. Consciousness is always consciousness of something. He claims that it has no particular nature, but takes on the coloration of whatever it's directed toward. So what he's saying, if we want to say it strongly, is there's no underlying substratum, no ego or subject that we have direct, explicit experience of, and that serves as the foundation and source of our consciousness. There is consciousness, but we find no underlying owner of that consciousness. Let me give you another little thought experiment. I'd like you to think, imagine, put an image in your mind of an apple. Let's make it a green one. And I'd like you to put another image in your mind of a banana. Let's make it ripe, a yellow one. Now I'd like you to put the yellow banana to the left of the green apple. Now put it to the right of the green apple. Now I want you to think and tell me if you had a direct image or experience of the mental you that was doing this. I bet you got a clear memory of the green apple, a clear memory of the yellow banana, but did you have a direct experience of a mental you that did that arranging of those items? Probably not. Sartre's view is one in which we're best understood just as that consciousness without an owner that does many different things. And the banana apple example is obviously a trivial one, but I think it makes the point. Sartre says that when I try to become aware of myself explicitly, I'm having to objectify myself, but I'm not an object. Now try to think of what you are. What do you come up with? Do you think you're a body? Are you your body? Who are you? What are you? What do you think about when I ask that? Do you think about your past? But here we are in the present. When you objectify yourself and look in that manner towards your past, that's not you. You've objectified something that's not even here now. Well, who are you? Think about your plans. What are you? Think about your plans. But they're in the future. They're going to be what you're going to do later. Anytime you think of who you are, what you are, don't you think of body, plans, past? What do you think of? Identification with a company with which you work? What do you think about? Sartre says whenever we think about ourselves, we do objectify ourselves, but we know we're not the object. We're the we who is thinking about that object, such as our plans, our body, or our future. Sartre says that to view ourselves, take my case to view myself, I do and must take some distance from myself. But now let's look at that I that takes distance from myself, that becomes the viewer of myself. I'm now viewing myself. Let me reflect now. Can I be aware of this I that's viewing myself? I don't seem to find an I that's viewing myself. If you remember for just a moment, some lectures ago, Kant said we need the concept of I. That's the way we do business, but we have no direct experience of an I. I'm not finding my I, though I'm using the word, I've got the concept. Now take a minute and ask yourself if you find an I that you could now have, reflect on, look at, you. If Sartre is right in some curious way, you can't find the I and you can't find the you. So what he says, now Heidegger back in 1929 never should have given this lecture about nothing. What Sartre says, thinking that he's improved on Heidegger, is that in fact what separates my knowing of myself from the self I know is nothing, but that I am this nothing. What can this mean? Is this wordplay? What kind of strange situation are we in? Sartre claims that this nothingness that we are, our consciousness in its changing, varying foci, creates agonizing existential problems for us. We do become aware that we can take up stances as we choose. We're not only free to do this or that, but we're also condemned to be free. We're always having to choose how we're going to be, and not choosing how we're going to be, that itself is a choice. Sartre says, again famously, we're condemned to freedom. We're condemned to always have to say it's going to be my choice that I have to make, or I make it by not making a choice that it's going to make the difference. And on his view, that creates considerable anxiety. But that anxiety is very, very fundamental, and that anxiety is a basic reaction to our fundamental freedom. Pause a moment and think. Heidegger says anxiety is fundamental to us, but what we should realize that anxiety concerns is that we really aren't altogether and shouldn't be and aren't fully at home in this world. However metaphorical it is, we are of another world, and that basic anxiety is a continuing reminder that in some sense we belong elsewhere, and that is where true meaning is to be found. Sartre, on the other hand, tells us that the anxiety, which he agrees with Heidegger that we have, is an anxiety over the fact that we're condemned always to have to choose, always to live, with a freedom that often we don't want to be burdened by. We don't have a fixed nature, and what we do couldn't follow from a fixed nature because, in fact, we don't have one. He claims that the fixed nature theory of us is self-deception, and that, again, we're totally free and must take responsibility for all our decisions, and that we could never justify those decisions other than to say, these decisions we are making. His notion of ways in which we connect with other people is quite extreme, and it's a source of potential despair. He's classified as an existentialist, and that means in part that we're fundamentally alone, however much we may connect at times with others, however often there's the fleeting miracle of coinciding emotion. But Sartre tells us that in our actual relations with each other, there are fundamental antagonisms and irreconcilable differences, and that they reside at the heart of relations with others. He says that we find ourselves in the world in terms of our projects, but since our essence is determined by our products, our projects, our existence, that the adopting of the particular projects that we adopt and the pursuing of them, that defines us. But as we pursue our projects, which include a certain kind of potential and a potential for objectification and use of other people, we discover other people too who have projects, and they are objectifying and using us. And in these circumstances, there's inevitably going to be a battle for recognition, a battle for whose projects are going to dominate. And if I am my decisions, if I am my projects, and how I really come in contact with other people is through projects, and there's a kind of competitive struggle to dominate, I objectify you in terms of seeing how you fit into my projects. You objectify me in terms of the way I fit into your projects. It's not exactly a happy picture of human life. Sartre has some things to say about love. He says that loving and being loved involve objectification, and that there's an underlying failure of mutuality, of a genuine underlying bond and intimacy. He even reflects in this matter, maybe that makes him the sort of engaging kind of French existentialist that was so popularized in the American media after the Second World War. He talks about extreme forms of objectification, such as in sadism and masochism. And I don't think we'll get terribly much into that in our time together during our journey. So Sartre does not have a very uplifting view of love. We should dwell to contrast it with other views of love that we meet along the way. Augustine, the Christian thinker, so influenced by Plato, had the charming notion that love destroys what we were so that we might become what we are not. Now, I'll admit I'm not exactly sure what that means, but sounds pretty good. Hegel, who we looked at as this grand figure who told us about the unfolding of history, says that if you weren't quite as smart as Hegel to explain it fully intellectually, you could simply say it was love disporting with itself. And that would be okay, just not as intelligently understood and explained as Hegel did with his philosophy. Kierkegaard tells us that on the one hand, a kind of perverse form of love in the aesthetic stage of life that involves seduction is important as an early part of a set of stages to lead us to a completely different love, a personal, individual, inward love of us for God and God for us. And of course, we've seen that Freud says, well, let's let meaning of life questions go by. We can't really make that much of them. And they're a sign that something in our love life and our work situation isn't working out. And if you'll remember, his account of love is that I love someone means I desire them, and happily they have an appreciation of me that's much like my appreciation of myself. Well, doesn't Sartre trump all these people? Love, objectification. Sartre says such things as life begins on the other side of despair. Sartre says such things as hell is other people. But after all, the French tend to be a bit dramatic, or at least some of them do. I don't want to get into national stereotypes now. But I do want to turn to another thinker of some significance, and that's Albert Camus, another French thinker who is broadly put in the existentialist category. Camus radicalizes the question of whether life has any meaning in a very dramatic way. What Camus claims is that the only fundamental philosophical question concerns whether one should commit suicide. Let's pause for a moment. What Schopenhauer has allotted us is the notion that it's too bad that we're here, but here we are, and we want to get beyond the urgings and cravings of what Schopenhauer calls the will, which probably is better understood as a craving energy, urges driving for satisfaction. And Schopenhauer says, well, it would be best to lose the will to live, but we shouldn't commit suicide because that would be an act of will. Well, that sounds suspiciously like a complicated thing a philosopher would say. On the other hand, what does Camus say? Camus says the one philosophical question, the one you must start with is, should I commit suicide? And he says that that question arises out of the simple circumstance that the world is absurd. It is meaningless, and it might well not be worth living in. And if the world's absurd, if it's meaningless, if life is absurd, and it may well not be worth living in, well, maybe suicide could be the answer. Now, let's relieve ourselves of this worry for a moment and say that at least in Camus' case, the decision for suicide wasn't made. But dwell on this for a moment. He thinks that's the question you start with. If Sartre could say life begins on the other side of despair, Camus says that life begins on the other side of asking the question, should I keep going? Maybe suicide would be the better option. And if there's going to be a meaning to life, it's going to be a consequence of first thinking, experiencing that all things considered, there is no meaning to life. And any meaning of life will have to turn out to be on the other side of that. Many portions of what Camus writes involve a kind of experience of the world as a kind of stage devoid of reality or depth. And that turns out to be life's truth. Now, I don't know what you might enjoy in the way of beverages that you drink. What Camus would be in effect suggesting, and it comes out in some of his writings, is life actually, as you look at it, is kind of like the chatter that goes on at an orange juice party, or apple juice party, or party involving alcoholic beverages. There's a lot of chat that goes on, but underneath it all, it's chit-chat. And that's kind of absurd, but that's what life is like, and you have to face up to it. What Camus tells us is that true integrity involves living with the absurdity of life and remaining open to the fact that life genuinely is absurd. And he says on the other side of the serious consideration of suicide, what you do is realize that suicide is actually escapist. Now that sounds more like Schopenhauer, doesn't it? Except for Camus, what you would be escaping would be the shallowness, the triviality, the meaninglessness of it all. But Camus does tell us that if we took that route, it would be an act of cowardice. At the same time, he says that hope that there is some other world, or that day after tomorrow or next month we will discover that life was meaningful and deep and significant after all. That kind of hope, Camus says, is delusional. So, we have the notion that suicide would be cowardly, and hope that we'll discover or make life meaningful after all, that's delusional and another form of escapism and cowardice. And so what Camus offers us is a continuing defiance, a heroic revolt in the face of life's absurdity. Life may not mean anything, but let us be courageous and not let that get us down. Let us not be put down by it. Let us live intensely in the present in the face of the underlying knowledge that nothing finally means anything. And Camus actually believes that if you do that, life in a curious way can be experienced by you as having a kind of enjoyment to it. And that you'll think that having more of it will be a good thing after all. There's a famous remark made by Winston Churchill, who asked the question, who would really want to live to be 95, quickly gave the answer, oh, just about everyone that's 94. Camus' view is simply this, that on the other side of absorbing that things are absurd, one can live in the present. One can live in every continuing present and hope that there are more of them, and that through that an integrity will be found. These existentialists we've been looking at, Kierkegaard, Heidegger, Nietzsche, Sartre, Camus, divide basically into two types. There's the slogan that supposedly explains existentialism. The slogan is that existence precedes essence. And it means what you do makes you who you are. And if you take the view that what you do makes you who you are, that's Nietzsche as existentialist. That's Sartre as existentialist. In many ways, that's Camus as existentialist. But we can't say that all existentialists think that existence precedes essence and who we are is a result of what we do, because Kierkegaard thinks we do have an essence more important than whatever we do, and that essence is to be children of God who finally can only be known by God. and that is our individuality, our essence. And Heidegger thinks that we have unique opportunities for authenticity in particular historical circumstances. And that is our essence, and it is more fundamental than our existence. So at least the slogan that existence precedes essence is not true of all these figures we've considered. But perhaps so much for these existential views, or perhaps we should hear more. Let's look in our next time together at two different philosophers, Michel Foucault and Jürgen Habermas, and how they understand what meaning might be like in the world in which we live.